Welcome to Historical Sleep Stories. Now, settle in. Let your shoulders soften and let your breathing slow. Tonight, we travel to the English countryside in the autumn of 1889 to a small stone cottage called Rosemere, where the lanes run narrow between hedgerows heavy with hawthorn. At the end of a quiet corridor stands a door of thick, dark oak. Behind it lives Mrs. Ashcombe, 57 years old, mistress of Rosemere Cottage, who has kept this larder since she came to the house as a young bride. She asks little of her days beyond this, the morning light finding its way to the same shelf, the seasons arriving one after another exactly as they always have. This is the story of Mrs. Ashcombe, and of the year that passed slowly and gently within her larder. The light came first, always the light. Each morning, before Mrs. Ashcombe had so much as reached for her shawl, the sun found its way through the high window of the larder and laid its narrow beam across the flagstones, precise as a ruled line drawn by a careful hand. She had watched it move over the years, season by season, high and brief in December, long and golden by June. And she had come to know the room not by the clock, but by where that strip of light fell. This morning it touched the third shelf from the door, just below the row of earthenware jars, and caught the dust suspended in the still air, turning it to something almost silver. She pushed the oak door wider, and the hinge gave its small, low sound, the same sound it had made every day for as long as she had lived at Rosemere. It was not a creak exactly, more a sigh, low and worn smooth, the voice of old wood accustomed to opening. The door itself she had always admired, in the quiet way one admires a thing too familiar to remark upon aloud. It was thick, thicker than any other door in the cottage, cut from a single slab of oak so old its grain had darkened to the colour of strong tea. A blacksmith long dead had forged its hinges, and where her palm had pressed against the wood each morning for 3 decades, a pale, smooth hollow had worn itself into the surface, shaped exactly to her hand. She smoothed her apron flat with one hand before reaching for the latch, then rested her palm in the worn hollow out of habit more than need, and let the door swing the rest of the way open on its own weight. Beyond it, the larder waited in its grey morning stillness, shelves rising into shadow, the light falling in its narrow gold path, the whole room holding itself in that particular hush that came before the day's business began. She did not step forward at once. She stood a moment on the threshold, as she often did, feeling the cool air move past her ankles into the warmer corridor behind, and the warmer air of the house drift past her shoulders into the cool of the room ahead. The two currents, crossing unseen, in the doorway where she stood. Then she stepped through, and the door settled behind her, and the light on the third shelf shifted, almost imperceptibly, as the sun climbed a little higher above Rosemere. Before anything else, there was the sound of her own footsteps on the flagstones, a soft, unhurried tread, stone answering stone. Mrs. Ashcombe moved along the first row of shelves the way she always did, beginning from the left, her eyes passing over each item without truly stopping, though her mind recorded everything. This was not counting, not exactly. It was closer to greeting. The tap of a jar lid, nudged gently to test its seal, rang out small and clear in the quiet room. Somewhere above her, a loose board in the shelving gave the faintest creak as her weight shifted on the flagstones beneath it. From the kitchen, muffled through the thick oak door came the distant clink of the kettle being filled, and further still, a bird beginning its morning song in the apple tree by the gate. She paused before the flour bin and lifted its wooden lid, and the sound it made, a soft, dry scrape of wood against wood, told her, before she even looked, that it was 3/4 full. She lowered it again, satisfied, and the lid settled with a gentle thud that seemed to echo briefly in the stillness of the stone room. This was how she took her inventory each morning, not with a ledger, though one existed, kept more from habit than necessity, but with her ears and her hands. A jar that rang hollow when tapped needed refilling. A sack that gave too easily beneath her palm was running low. The larder spoke to her in these small sounds, and she had learned, over many years, to listen. At the end of the row, she stopped, and for a moment there was no sound at all, only the faint hush of the house settling around her, the particular silence of early morning that exists nowhere else in the day. Then, somewhere beyond the high window, a cartwheel creaked along the lane, and the ordinary day resumed its quiet unfolding. She turned, satisfied that all was as it should be, and moved on to the next shelf. The moment she reached the preserve shelf, the smell reached her first, sweet and faintly tart, warmed by years of accumulated sugar and fruit, a scent that seemed to live permanently in the wood itself. Row upon row of jars stood before her, their contents catching what little light found its way this deep into the room. Deep plum preserve, dark as garnet, golden marmalade, its peel suspended like something caught mid-fall, greengage jam, pale and faintly cloudy. Each jar wore a small paper label, her own handwriting faded now to a soft brown, marking the month and the year it had been made. She lifted one, the plum from 3 autumns past, and turned it slowly, watching the fruit shift and settle within, thick and slow as something remembering how to move. The scent that clung to the glass was almost imagined, sealed as it was beneath its wax and paper cap. And yet she was certain she could smell it all the same. Sun-warmed plums from the tree by the old wall, sugar dissolving in the great copper pan, the whole kitchen thick with steam on the September afternoon she had made it. She set the jar back in its place, careful to align it with its neighbors, and let her eyes travel along the shelf. Here was a kind of history, she thought, though she rarely put the thought into words. Each jar marked a day she could no longer fully recall in its particulars, and yet the fruit remembered for her held the exact sweetness of that August, that September, sealed and waiting. Somewhere further down the row stood the last jars of a very old batch, made in the first year of her marriage, their labels almost illegible now. She never opened these. She was not sure she meant to. It was enough, some mornings, simply to know they were there. The scent of sugared fruit lingered around her a moment longer, sweet and close, before the cooler air of the stone room reasserted itself, and she moved on. Past the glass and paper labels of the preserve shelf stood a heavier, plainer row. Great earthenware jars, brown glazed and broad-bellied, each one large enough to hold both her forearms at once. She reached the first and rested her palm against its curved side. The glaze was cool beneath her hand, cool in the particular way that only fired clay could be, smoother than stone, yet somehow more alive to the touch, faintly uneven where the potter's fingers had once shaped it. She let her hand travel down to where the jar's shoulder narrowed, feeling the small ridge where lid met body, worn slightly smooth from years of lifting. Inside this one, she knew without looking, lay flour, pale and soft, sifted fine, enough to see the household through several weeks of baking. She lifted the heavy wooden lid, and her fingers, out of long habit, dipped briefly into the flour surface, feeling its dry powdery give, cool and faintly resistant, like pressing into fresh snow. The next jar held oats, coarser beneath her touch, each grain distinct where the flour had felt like a single yielding mass. She could tell the difference blind, she thought. Could have walked this row, with her eyes closed, and known each jar by the particular texture waiting beneath its lid. Further along stood the jars of dried peas and beans, and these she did not open, only rested her hand against the clay a moment, feeling its solidity, its patient weight. These old vessels held their own kind of steadiness, heavier and plainer than the delicate preserve jars built for endurance rather than display, holding within them the plain, sustaining foods that carried a household through the leaner months. She drew her hand back at last, brushing the last traces of flour from her fingertips, and the earthenware jars stood on, cool and solid, exactly as they always did. Overhead, where the ceiling beams crossed low and dark above the shelves, hung the bundles of drying herbs. And it was here, more than anywhere in the larder, that warmth seemed to gather, though the room itself remained cool. Lavender hung in loose bunches, their stalks tied with plain string, the small purple heads gone soft and papery with drying. Beside them, sage leaves curled inward on themselves, silver green and faintly dusty. Rosemary hung in longer sprigs, its needles darkened almost to black where they had dried fastest near the beam, and thyme in small, modest clusters that seemed, even dried, to hold something of the summer garden they had come from. Mrs. Ashcombe stood beneath them a moment, and though the stone room around her held its usual coolness, something about standing under these bundles, the low ceiling, the close arrangement of the beams, the herbs suspended just above her head, carried a suggestion of warmth, as though the memory of the July afternoons on which they had been gathered still clung faintly to their dried leaves. She reached up and let her fingers brush against the lavender, and a fine dust of pollen and dried petal drifted down, catching for a moment in the narrow beam of light before settling, unseen, upon the shelf below. Each bundle had its season of gathering fixed in her memory, though she rarely thought to name it. The rosemary had come in early June, cut just before the flowers opened, when the oil in the leaves ran strongest. The sage had waited until August, when the leaves grew broad and full. She had learned this rhythm from her own mother, in a kitchen much like this one, in a larder not unlike this larder, learned it not through instruction so much as through years of simply watching and being present, and eventually finding the knowledge settled quietly into her own hands. She lowered her arm, and the herbs swayed gently on their strings, and the low beams held their warmth a while longer in the cool of the room. Nearer the door, at a height she could reach without stretching, stood the tea shelf, smaller than the others, more carefully tended, holding tins whose lids had gone soft and dark with handling. Mrs. Ashcombe lifted the nearest and worked the lid free with a practiced twist. Inside lay black tea, tightly curled, and though she did not taste it here, that pleasure waited for the kitchen, for the kettle, for the particular ritual of pouring. She found that simply looking at the leaves seemed to summon something of their flavor to memory, the bright, faintly bitter warmth of the first sip, the way it settled into something rounder and gentler by the second cup. Beside the black tea stood a smaller tin of something pale and fragrant, dried chamomile flowers, gathered from the bed near the garden wall, kept for evenings when a gentler cup was wanted. And beside that, a tin of mint, its scent so persistent that it had, over the years, worked its way faintly into the wood of the shelf itself, so that even the plain oak here carried the ghost of it. She thought, briefly and without sadness, of the mornings this shelf had served. The tea taken alone at the kitchen table in the quiet hour before the household woke. The tea shared, on rarer mornings, with a visiting friend. The two of them speaking softly over the same blend she now held in her hands. She had always found a particular pleasure in choosing the tea before the kettle was even filled, in standing here in the cool hush of the larder, deciding which small comfort the day would begin with. It was the smallest of the household's daily rituals, but she had never found it a small thing to begin the day with a choice made gently and without hurry. She twisted the lid firmly back into place, brushed a faint dusting of leaf from the shelf's edge with the side of her hand, and turned the tin so its label faced outward, ready for the next morning's choosing. The last shelf in this corner caught the light differently from the rest, not the pale beam from the high window, but a warmer, richer glow that seemed to come from the honey itself. 3 jars stood in a row, each a slightly different shade of gold, from the pale, almost clear honey of early spring to the deep amber of the late summer gathering. Mrs. Ashcombe pressed her thumb against the wax paper, sealing the darkest jar, testing that it still held firm, then turned the label so it faced outward and pressed down its curling corner. Lifting the jar, she angled it so the thin strip of daylight passed through the glass, and the honey inside seemed to hold the light rather than simply reflect it, glowing faintly from within like something lit by its own small fire. A gap showed further along the shelf where the last of the clover honey had gone, and she moved the newest jar back to fill it, bringing an older one forward to be used before its sweetness had time to darken. Beside the honey stood a row of beeswax candles, pale cream in color, their wicks trimmed and waiting, each one rolled and shaped by her own hands the previous autumn. She had always found something satisfying in this small alchemy. The same hive that filled these jars with sweetness had also, in its way, provided the means to light the room where the sweetness was kept. She set the honey jar down and picked up one of the candles instead, turning it between her fingers. Even unlit, it carried a faint scent, warm, waxen, touched with something almost floral, the last trace of whatever blossoms the bees had visited that year. She thought, as she often did at this shelf, of the hives at the bottom of the garden, humming quietly through the warm months, entirely unaware of the small, useful miracles they left behind for the larder to keep. The light through the high window had shifted further now, no longer falling on the flower bin, but reaching almost to her feet, and Mrs. Ashcombe understood, without needing to check the hour, that the morning was moving on, and that soon the rest of the house would wake, and the day beyond the oak door would begin in earnest. She set the candle back in its place among the others, and for a moment longer she simply stood, golden honey to her left, pale wax beside it, the whole shelf glowing faintly gold in the morning light, before turning, at last, toward the door. A cartwheel rattled along the lane and slowed at Rosemare's gate, and moments later came 3 short knocks against the kitchen door. "Morning, Mum," said the boy on the step, holding out a basket nearly as wide as he was. Tom, the grocer's son, came twice a week, rain or shine, his boots always a size too large for him, and his cap pushed back off his forehead. Mrs. Ashcombe took the basket with both hands and thanked him, and he was gone again before she had reached the larder door, his boots slapping against the flagged path. She set the basket on the low table just inside and began to unpack it, item by item, onto the front edge of the shelf reserved for such mornings. A cabbage, still damp with garden soil, a twist of paper holding sugar, heavier than it looked, a side of bacon wrapped in muslin, its salt crust rough beneath her fingers as she checked it for firmness. She counted the eggs into a shallow bowl, 6 of them, turning each one gently to be sure none had cracked in the jostling of the cart, and set the bowl on its usual shelf where the morning light would not reach it. The cabbage she left on the table a moment, brushing loose soil from its outer leaves before carrying it through to the vegetable crates, and paused to check the crate's straw bedding, plumping it with her fingers where it had flattened since the last delivery. Everything had its place, and she moved through the unpacking without needing to think where each thing belonged. The bacon hung from its hook, the sugar tucked into its tin, the empty basket set by the door to be returned to Tom on his next visit. When the last item had found its shelf, she stood a moment with the empty basket in her hands, running through what the week ahead would need. Flour was running low, she remembered. She had heard it in the scrape of the bin lid that morning. She would tell Tom's father Thursday when the cart came round again. She hung the basket on its peg by the door and turned back toward the shelves, already thinking of what else the day would ask of her. The scent of the apples reached the larder before the fruit itself did, carried in on the draught each time the door opened, sharp, faintly sweet, the smell of a garden already turning toward autumn. Mrs. Ashcombe carried the crate to the long table beneath the window and began, one by one, to lift each apple free and turn it in her hands, feeling for the soft give of a bruise beneath the skin. Most passed this test easily, their flesh firm beneath her thumb, and these she wrapped in squares of newspaper, twisting the paper closed at the stem the way her mother had shown her, so that each apple sat wrapped like a small parcel, sealed against the damp. A few she set aside, with a brown patch spreading beneath the skin near its base, another with a soft bruise from where it had fallen. These would go to the kitchen for today's use, rather than the shelf for winter's keeping, since a bruised apple, left too long among sound ones, would hasten the spoiling of its neighbours. She worked steadily, wrapping and setting each parcel onto the shelf in careful rows, leaving a finger's width of space between them so that air might move freely and no 2 skins would touch. It was slow work, and she did not hurry it. An apple wrapped too loosely would rattle free of its paper by December. One wrapped too tightly might bruise against its neighbor before the month was out. By the time the crate stood empty, the shelf held 4 full rows. Each apple settled into its own small nest of paper, waiting out the months until the frost outside made the cold within this room seem, by comparison, almost gentle. Before folding the crate away, she tore a strip from the last sheet of newspaper and wrote the month across it in pencil, tucking the slip beneath the front row where her hand would find it easily come spring. A small note to herself about when this particular shelf had been filled. She folded the empty crate flat and set it by the door, then wiped her palms against her apron, the last trace of orchard dust and paper dry against her skin. 2 loaves, still faintly warm through their cloth wrapping, waited on the kitchen table when Mrs. Ashcombe came through, with the bread basket balanced against her hip. She lined the basket first, laying a clean cloth into its base and letting the edges fall over the sides, then set the loaves in. The larger one, meant for tomorrow's breakfast, laid crust down so the softer underside would not dry against the air. The second, smaller loaf, she left crust up, since this one would be wanted sooner, likely before the day was through. Carrying the basket into the larder, she set it on the high shelf reserved for bread, well beyond reach of anything that might wish to share it. She had lost a loaf once, years before, to a mouse bold enough to climb the lower shelves, and had moved the bread basket up that same week and never moved it back. She checked, too, that the small stone weight she kept beside the basket still sat firm against the lid of the flour bin nearby, a habit as old as the shelf itself. She folded the cloth's edges back over the loaves, tucking them close, and pressed the crust of the larger loaf lightly with 2 fingers, testing that it had cooled enough not to sweat inside its wrapping. Satisfied, she smoothed the cloth flat one final time. Tomorrow's bread would begin the day exactly as this loaf ended it. Cut at the kitchen table in the early quiet, the first slice still faintly fragrant with yeast, spread with butter, carried up from the crock below. She thought of this now only briefly, the way one thinks of a small pleasure still a day away, and turned from the shelf toward the door, the basket settled and the loaves resting undisturbed above her. The butter had come up from the dairy that morning, still soft from churning, and Mrs. Ashcombe pressed it now into the wooden mould kept for this purpose, working it firm with the back of a wooden paddle until no air pockets remained beneath the surface. She smoothed the top with 2 even strokes, then turned the mould over onto a plate, tapping its base until the pale golden block released and held its shape, a fleur-de-lis pattern pressed into its surface from the mould's carved underside, the same pattern her mother had used, and her mother before that. Wrapping the block in a square of muslin, she carried it to the stone shelf set lowest in the larder, where the floor's chill rose most directly into the air. This shelf never warmed, even in the height of summer, and it was here, more than anywhere else in the room, that she could press her palm flat against the stone and feel the cold travel straight up through her fingers into her wrist. 2 crocks already stood in the shelf's shadow, their contents used part way down, and she checked each in turn, pressing a fingertip into the older one to judge how much remained before the week's baking would need more. She set the new block beside them, angling it so the fleur-de-lis faced outward. A muslin cloth, damp from the croc's own moisture. She draped loosely over the top, rather than sealing it fully, since butter kept too tightly wrapped in. This cool would sweat rather than stay dry. She rinsed the paddle in the small basin kept for such tasks and set it to dry on the shelf's edge, then rested her palm once more against the stone before straightening, the cold of it lingering faintly in her fingers even after she had turned away. The cheese wheel stood where it always stood, in the shadowed corner furthest from both window and door, wrapped in its cloth and resting on a bed of clean straw. Mrs. Ashcombe knelt beside it and unwound the cloth part way, checking the rind beneath. Pale still, though a faint grey bloom had begun to spread across one side, exactly as it should at this stage. She pressed her thumb gently against the surface and felt it give, just slightly, the way a ripening cheese ought to give, and no more. Turning the wheel a quarter turn, she rested it on a fresh patch of straw, since a cheese left too long on the same spot would ripen unevenly, softer on the side pressed against the floor. She had learned this the hard way years before, from a wheel gone soft and sour on one edge, while the rest remained hard as chalk. She rewrapped the cloth, tucking its ends beneath the wheel's base, and brushed a few loose strands of straw from her skirt before rising. The scent that clung to this corner of the larder was sharper than anywhere else in the room. Not unpleasant, but distinct. A smell she had grown so accustomed to over the years that she scarcely noticed it now except in moments like this one, kneeling close beside the source of it. By her reckoning, another fortnight would see this wheel ready for the table. She made a small mark in her memory rather than her ledger, a thing to check again in 2 weeks' time. She smoothed the straw bed flat with her palm before rising, tucking any loose strands back beneath the wheel's edge so nothing lay scattered across the flagstones, and left the corner as she had found it, cloth settled, undisturbed, but for the quarter turn she had given the wheel itself. Rain had begun to fall outside, a soft, steady patter against the high window by the time Mrs. Ashcombe knelt before the wooden crates stacked along the larder's far wall. She lifted the lid from the first. Potatoes, layered in dry straw, their skins pale with the dust of the root cellar they had come from. Working through them methodically, she sorted the larger from the smaller, setting the largest into a shallow basket for tonight's supper, and returning the rest to their bed of straw, layering fresh handfuls between each row to keep them from touching. The second crate held carrots, their tops still faintly green where they had not yet withered, and these she checked for softness before nestling them back beneath their own covering of sand, kept slightly damp to stop them shriveling before spring. She tested the sand between 2 fingers and found it drying at one edge, so she carried a small cup of water from the basin and worked it through with her hand until the whole bed felt evenly cool again. In the third crate, the onions had begun, here and there, to send up a pale green shoot, a sign, she knew, that this batch would not keep much longer. She worked through them carefully, setting 3 sprouting bulbs aside for the kitchen's immediate use and leaving the rest among their firmer neighbours. The rain outside had grown heavier while she worked, its sound filling the small window and softening every other noise in the room, and she stopped to listen a moment, straw-dusted hands resting on the crate's edge before pressing the lids back into place, one after another, and rising to carry the sprouting onions through to the kitchen. By early afternoon, the larder had settled into the particular hour when nothing needed doing. A grey cat had followed Mrs. Ashcombe in through the open door, and now lay curled on the flagstones just inside the threshold, in the one patch of floor still warmed faintly by the midday sun. She stepped carefully around it as she crossed to the linen shelf, where a stack of folded cloths waited to be checked for damp. She unfolded the topmost cloth, ran her palm across its surface, and finding it dry, folded it again along its original creases, smaller and neater than before, and set it back in place. Through the high window, she could see the gardener's shoulders passing back and forth beyond the glass, bent over some task in the herb bed, though his exact work was hidden from this angle. And she did not wonder long about it. She drew the second cloth from the stack and did the same. Unfold, press, fold, replace. The small task requiring so little of her attention that her mind wandered freely as her hands worked, touching briefly on nothing in particular: the weather, the state of the bread, whether the cat would still be there when she finished. When the last cloth had been checked and returned to its stack, she found herself in no hurry to move to the next task. She lowered herself onto the low stool kept by the door, and the cat, unbothered by her nearness, shifted only enough to press its back more fully into the warmth of the sun. She sat there a while, hands loose in her lap, listening to nothing more than the faint scrape of the gardener's tools beyond the window and the cat's slow, even breathing beside her feet. By the time Mrs. Ashcombe returned to the larder that evening, the high window had gone dark, and she carried with her one of the beeswax candles from the shelf, its small flame throwing a soft, moving light across the stone. She walked the room once more, as she had that morning, though everything looked different by this light. The jars no longer catching daylight, but instead holding small, warm reflections of the flame itself, each one flickering faintly as she passed. She tapped the flower bin's lid once, listening for its answer, and pressed the wax seal of a preserve jar to be sure it still held firm. At the bread shelf, she checked the cloth was still tucked close around the loaves, and at the butter crock, she smoothed the muslin flat where it had begun to slip. Small corrections, none of them urgent, each one a final word exchanged with the room before she left it for the night. She set the candle on the small ledge by the door and drew the flower bin's lid fully shut. It scraped softer in the evening hush than it had sounded that morning. The oak door creaked as she pulled it closed behind her, and she turned the key in its lock, the small metal click marking the day's end the way it had marked 1,000 evenings before. In her apron pocket, the key settled against her hip, and she carried the candle back down the stone corridor toward the kitchen, its light swaying gently against the walls with each step, until the corridor turned and the larder was left behind in the dark, waiting, as it always did, for morning. The window stood open for the first time since autumn, propped with a folded cloth, and through the gap came the thin, sweet smell of new grass and something less definable, simply the smell of the year turning. Mrs. Ashcombe worked along the shelves with a damp cloth in one hand and a dry one tucked beneath her arm, wiping first the flower bin's lid, then the row of preserve jars, lifting each one just enough to pass the cloth beneath before setting it back exactly where it had stood. The dust that came away against the white cloth was grey with a whole winter's stillness, and she rinsed it clean in the basin by the door before continuing. She lifted the herb bundles down from the beam one by one and found two gone brittle past any use. Last year's rosemary crumbling to dust between her fingers, its oil long spent. These she set aside for burning rather than cooking, leaving a bare space on the beam where new cuttings would hang once the season allowed it. The linen shelf she emptied entirely, shaking each cloth out through the open window before refolding it along creases worn soft with use, and stopped at a small moth hole near one corner. A thing to mend, though not today. She set that cloth apart from the rest, at the bottom of the stack, where it would wait until her mending basket next came out. By the time she had worked her way around the room, the light through the window had travelled further across the floor than when she began, and the larder smelled less of the months just past and more of the soap and grass drifting in from the garden. She left the window open a while longer, wanting the room to hold the freshness before the evening chill sent her back to close it. A basket of elderflower heads waited on the table, cut that morning while the dew still held their scent close, their small white blooms already beginning to droop in the day's warmth. Mrs. Ashcombe lined a wide bowl with muslin and lifted the flowers in by the handful, letting the syrup beneath, steeped overnight with lemon and sugar, filter slowly through the cloth, drop by, amber drop, into the bowl below. The last of the lemon peel had gone soft and pale in the steeping, and she lifted it free with 2 fingers before it could pass through the cloth, setting it aside on a saucer rather than let its bitterness slip into the finished cordial. She gathered the muslin's corners and twisted, wringing out the last of the liquid with both hands until her fingers ached faintly from the effort. The bottles stood ready in a row, rinsed and dried, and she filled each one with the help of a small tin funnel, wiping the neck of every bottle before fitting its cork, pressing each one home with the heel of her palm until it sat flush. She labelled the bottles as she had labelled the preserve jars years before her, writing the date in small, careful letters on strips of paper pasted just below the neck, and set them along the coolest shelf where the elderflower's delicate sweetness would keep longest. One bottle she set apart from the rest, meaning to carry it to the kitchen that evening, to taste against the cordial from the year before, not from any doubt in her recipe, but from the small pleasure of comparing one summer's flowers against another's, and finding, as she always did, that they were never quite the same. A knock came at the kitchen door around midday, light and familiar, and Mrs. Pride from the cottage across the lane stepped in with a basket balanced against her hip, its contents catching the light in deep, glossy red. "More than we can eat before Sunday, I'm afraid," she said, setting the basket down. "Then they'll keep better as jam than they would on the vine," Mrs. Ashcombe answered, already reaching for her apron. They worked together at the kitchen table, hulling the fruit side by side, the green caps falling into a bowl between them, and though little more passed between them than the occasional remark on the weather, or the state of the lane after last week's rain, the quiet company made the task shorter than it would have been alone. Mrs. Pride sorted out the smallest, most bruised berries into a separate dish as she worked, setting them toward the day's use rather than the jam pot, a habit Mrs. Ashcombe recognized as her own. Once the jam had cooked and cooled, Mrs. Ashcombe carried the jars through to the larder herself, sealing each with a disc of waxed paper, pressed flush against the surface, and labeled them in her usual hand before setting them on the shelf beside last year's row, still faintly darker in color than the fresh batch beside it. One jar she set apart, meaning to send it back across the lane with Mrs. Pride before the week was out, a small return for a basket too full for one household alone. Heat pressed close against the high window by early afternoon, and even here, in the coolest room of the cottage, Mrs. Ashcombe could feel it faintly through the stone. She had brought in a fresh cutting of basil and thyme from the garden bed, their leaves still warm from the sun, and she tied them now into small bundles with the same plain string she used for every herb the larder had ever held, wrapping each knot twice and trimming the loose ends short so no stray thread might catch on a passing sleeve. The rosemary space left bare since spring cleaning, she filled at last with a new cutting, longer and greener than the last, and hung it where the old bundle once had, testing the string's hold with a gentle tug before letting it settle. Working beneath the beam, she brushed a fine dust of pollen from her sleeve, where it had drifted down from the lavender, dried now to its familiar papery softness, and glanced up at the row of bundles taking shape above her, sage still curling inward as it always did, thyme in its modest clusters, and now this new green addition, not yet dry, still holding the full brightness of the garden it had come from. She left the door open a crack behind her as she worked, letting the warm outside air mingle briefly with the cool of the room, and somewhere beyond the wall she could hear the low, steady sound of bees working the lavender border, a sound she had grown so used to over the years that she scarcely noticed it was there at all until for a moment it stopped. Her fingers were stained faintly purple at the tips, the mark of an afternoon spent among the brambles at the field's edge, and the smell of the fruit still clung to her hands even now, hours later, as she set the last of the jam pots onto the larder table. She pressed a fingertip lightly against the surface of the nearest pot, testing for the faint wrinkle that told her the jam had set properly. One pot lagged a little behind the rest, its surface still too smooth beneath her touch, and she set that one apart to check again, once it had cooled a while longer, before sealing the sound pots with their wax discs, smoothing the paper flat with the side of her thumb, and wiping each rim clean of any stray drips. One by one, she carried the pots to the preserve shelf, setting them beside the strawberry jam from earlier in the season, the two rows sitting close together now, pale red beside deep, near black purple, marking one summer's fruit against another's, without either needing a word said over it. She rinsed her stained fingers in the basin by the door, though the colour did not fully leave them, and glanced once more at the full row, before turning away, already thinking of the brambles still heavy with fruit at the field's edge, waiting for tomorrow's picking. The whole room seemed to carry the scent of the spice tin, long after Mrs. Ashcombe had closed its lid. Cinnamon sharp against the back of the throat, cloves darker and heavier beneath it, a faint bite of mustard seed threading through both. She had tied the whole spices, cinnamon stick, a handful of cloves, a spoonful of peppercorns, into a small square of muslin, knotted twice for good measure, and set it aside to be added to the pot once the pears were peeled and chopped through in the kitchen. Here in the larder, her task was simpler, preparing the jars themselves, checking each lid for rust along its rim, and setting aside two that showed the faintest orange bloom, unfit for the sealed keeping a chutney demanded. The sound jars she rinsed once more under hot water from the kettle and stood them upside down on a clean cloth to dry, watching the last drops gather and fall from each rim before she judged them ready. When the finished chutney came through from the kitchen, dark and thick and still faintly warm, she ladled it into the sound jars, wiped each rim clean before fitting the lid, and tied a small square of gingham over each cap, more custom than necessity, fastened with a length of kitchen string. She labelled the jars last of all and set them toward the back of the shelf, since chutney, unlike jam, only improved with a few months of patient waiting, its sharper spices softening and rounding together the longer it was left undisturbed in the dark. A cart creaked to a stop outside, heavier laden than any that had come that season, and moments later the gardener appeared at the larder door with a crate balanced against each hip. "Last of the squash, ma'am," he said, setting them down just inside the threshold. "And the pumpkins besides, if you'll have them." She thanked him and set to work at once, sorting the harvest by size across the lowest shelf. The largest pumpkins set apart on their own bed of straw where their weight would not crush anything beneath them. The squash she arranged in a single layer, careful that none touched its neighbor, since a bruise on one skin would spread its rot to whatever it lay against. Her hands, dry with the season's dust, found a soft patch near the stem of one smaller pumpkin, and she set it aside for the kitchen's immediate use rather than risk it spoiling the rest through the winter months ahead. With a stub of chalk kept on the shelf's edge for this purpose, she marked the date across the side of the largest pumpkin, the same way she had marked every autumn's first squash for as long as she had kept this room, a small habit that let her judge, by spring, how well each one had truly kept. By the time the last of the crates stood empty, the low shelf had taken on the full, heavy look of true autumn. Orange and green and pale gold crowded together, the larder's plainest corner now its fullest, and she straightened with the particular satisfaction of a room well provided for. A cold thread of air found its way beneath the door that evening, thin as a wire, and Mrs. Ashcombe knelt to press a rolled strip of cloth against the gap, tucking its ends in firmly on either side. She checked the high window next, running a finger along its frame until she found the place where the putty had begun to crack, and made a note to have it seen to before the first true frost arrived. For now, a folded cloth wedged along the sill would have to serve, and she tucked it in firmly enough that a strong wind would not work it loose overnight. The last of the tender herbs, basil, too delicate to survive even a mild cold snap, she cut and bundled early, hanging them lower than the hardier rosemary and thyme so they might dry before the room's temperature dropped further still. The preserve jars nearest the outer wall she shifted inward by a shelf, away from the stone that would grow coldest first once winter properly set in. She stood a moment by the window, watching the gardener bank straw around the base of the apple trees beyond the glass, his breath showing faintly white in the evening air, and understood without needing the almanac to tell her that the season had turned its final corner. Every shelf in the larder stood full now, fuller than at any other point in the year, and Mrs. Ashcombe walked its length slowly, taking in the whole of what the seasons had given. Jams and chutneys crowded the preserve shelf in rows 3 deep. The root crates sat heavy with potatoes and carrots bedded in straw, and the squash and pumpkins from the autumn harvest still held their place along the lowest shelf, though fewer now than when the gardener had first carried them in. She ran a hand along the flour bin's lid, finding it near full after the miller's last delivery, and moved on to the honey shelf, where 3 jars stood exactly as they had stood since summer, waiting their turn. She took no formal count, kept no new tally in her ledger. This walk through the room was simply a way of knowing, the way a person might walk once more through a house before nightfall, confirming that all was as it should be. At the door, she stopped to straighten a jar that had drifted slightly out of its row, nudging it back into line with 2 fingers, and allowed herself for a moment the plain satisfaction of a larder well prepared for the months ahead. The spice tin gave a soft rattle as Mrs. Ashcombe lifted its lid, and the scent that rose from within seemed to fill the whole corner of the room at once. Cinnamon, cloves, a trace of nutmeg beneath both. She refilled the smaller jars from the larger tins, tipping cinnamon sticks carefully so none snapped in the pouring, and counted out cloves by the small spoonful into their own glass container, its lid stained faintly brown from years of use. The whole nutmeg she grated fresh against the little tin grater, kept for the purpose, working slowly until a fine, fragrant dust had gathered in the dish below. These were the spices of winter cooking, she thought, without quite framing the thought in words. The ones called for in mulled cordial, in spiced bread, in the puddings that would soon take their turn at the kitchen fire. She tied a fresh bundle of cinnamon sticks with kitchen string and hung it from a small hook near the herb beam, where its scent could mingle faintly with the lavender and rosemary already there. She wiped the spice grater clean and set it back in its drawer, and for a while after she had finished, the warm smell of cinnamon lingered in the cool air, refusing, for once, to be entirely claimed by the room's usual coolness. The kettle's whistle carried faintly down the corridor from the kitchen, and Mrs. Ashcombe reached for the tea tin she had set ready that morning, the black tea Mrs. Pride preferred to the chamomile. Her neighbour had come in out of the early dark, stamping the cold from her boots at the threshold, and the 2 women settled at the kitchen table while the tea steeped, a small jar of honey and a fresh-cut loaf brought through from the larder between them. "Good crop this year," Mrs. Pride said, spreading honey thick across her slice. "Better than last," Mrs. Ashcombe agreed, and said little more, content to let the warmth of the kitchen and the quiet company fill the space where words might otherwise have gone. When her neighbour had gone home again, back across the dark lane, Mrs. Ashcombe carried the honey jar and the tea tin back through to the larder, setting each in its place among the shelves. The room received them without complaint, as it always did, the small gap in the honey row closing again the moment the jar was returned. She stood a moment in the doorway, the last of the tea's warmth still on her tongue, before turning back toward the kitchen and the last small tasks of the evening. The first snow had begun sometime in the night, unannounced, and by the time Mrs. Ashcombe came to the larder that morning, it lay thick enough on the sill outside the high window to soften the light falling through the glass. She lit a candle earlier than she might have in summer, the daylight too dim on its own to see clearly by, and its small flame threw a warmer light across the shelves than the pale winter sun could manage alone. The preserve jars caught this new light differently than they had in autumn, steadier, softer, without the flicker that candlelight brought in the evenings. She checked the seals along the nearest row, pressing each wax disc gently with her thumb, and found them all sound. Outside, beyond the frosted glass, the world had gone entirely white and entirely silent. The lane and the garden and the gate all folded beneath the same pale covering. Inside, the room held its own weather, unhurried by the snow beyond the wall, its rows of jars and its low beams of drying herbs continuing on exactly as they had the day before, and the day before that. Only one jar of the summer's strawberry preserve remained, set apart at the very end of its row, the last of a batch that had once filled 5, after one had gone home with Mrs. Pride in the summer. Mrs. Ashcombe lifted it now and turned it slowly in the candlelight, the fruit within holding still the deep red it had carried since the July afternoon it was made. She did not open it. Not yet. It would wait for some particular morning still to come, a cold one when its brightness would mean more than it did today. She set it back in its place, alone now on the shelf where 5 jars had once stood together, and beside it left a small space, empty but not yet troubling, the kind of gap that would close again come next July when the strawberries ripened once more at the field's edge. The row looked different for it, thinner, further along in its own quiet telling of the year, and she let her eyes rest on it only a moment before turning to the next task the evening asked of her. The last light had long since left the high window by the time Mrs. Ashcombe made her final round, candle in hand, moving along shelves grown familiar to her fingers even in near darkness. She pressed the flower bin's lid shut. It scraped softer now than it had been that morning. She checked the door's cloth seal, still tucked firm against the draught. She straightened the honey jars, the tea tin, the last strawberry preserve sitting alone in its thinned row, each one exactly where it belonged. At the threshold, she rested her palm once more in the worn hollow of the oak, the same hollow her hand had pressed into that morning, and every morning before it, and drew the door close behind her. The hinge gave its familiar low sound, no louder than a breath, and the latch settled into place with a small, certain click. She turned the key, and it slipped into her apron pocket, cool against her hip, as she carried the candle back down the stone corridor, its light swaying gently against the walls with each step, until the corridor turned and the larder was left behind in the dark. The larder held its silence through the night, shelves and jars and hanging herbs all settled in the dark, waiting without waiting, the way a room does when no one is there to ask anything of it. Before dawn, the first grey light found its way to the high window, and by the time the household stirred, it had reached the third shelf from the door, just as it always did, catching the dust in the still air and turning it, briefly, to something almost silver. Mrs. Ashcombe would come again soon, apron smoothed, key in hand, and the door would swing open on its old hinge, and the cool air would meet the warm, and the small rituals of another morning would begin exactly as they always had. The room would ask nothing of her but attention, and she, in her quiet way, would give it. Historical sleep stories will be waiting for you whenever you're ready for another peaceful journey through history.